3:44 p.m. The South China Sea. Broad daylight. The sky is cloudless and brilliant. A hard tropical blue that offers no cover, no shadow, no concealment for 360 degrees in every direction. The sea is calm. Visibility is unlimited. And 142 miles southeast of the Paracel Islands, USS George Washington was cutting north at 22 knots. Her flight deck active, her air wing cycling through afternoon sorties, her battle group spread across 40 square miles of open ocean in the precise formation that a carrier strike group uses when it means to be seen. She was meant to be seen. Her presence in the South China Sea was deliberate, visible, and intentional. A message to Beijing that the United States Navy operated in international waters without permission from any government on Earth, and would continue to do so regardless of any claim, any artificial island, or any quantity of diplomatic protest that Beijing chose to submit. USS George Washington was a statement written in 100,000 tons of American steel. And the statement was this: these are free waters, and we are here, in the underground command facility of the PLA Rocket Force's Southern Theater Command. A general had been watching that statement for 6 days. He had been watching it on satellite feeds, on radar tracks, on the continuous intelligence picture that the China's surveillance architecture produced around the carrier's movements. And for 6 days, he had been finalizing the targeting solution for an operation that the PLA had been developing for 17 years. The DF-21D, the weapon the Chinese military press had named the Carrier Killer, a medium-range ballistic missile with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle, a warhead that could adjust its trajectory in terminal phase, defeating the predictive intercept geometry that conventional ballistic missile defense systems relied upon. Range: over 1,500 kilometers. Circular error probable against a moving naval target. Assessed by Chinese engineers at under 20 meters after terminal guidance correction. Warhead: penetrating, designed to drive through a carrier's flight deck and detonate in the hangar bay below. Against an undefended carrier, the weapon's designers had calculated that 2 hits would be sufficient to end flight operations permanently. The general had not allocated 2 missiles. He had allocated 12 DF-21D missiles in a compressed salvo, fired from 4 mobile launcher batteries positioned across Hainan Island and the adjacent mainland coast, timed to arrive on USS George Washington within a 40-second impact window, a window so compressed that no existing naval missile defense system had ever been tested against it. Simultaneously, 48 PL-15 beyond visual range air-to-air missiles would be fired by a combat air patrol of 8 J-16 fighters positioned north of the carrier's track, targeting the FA-18S and F-35CS currently airborne from the carrier's deck, and 18 YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, launched from a pair of H-6K bombers orbiting at high altitude over the Paracels, would arrive in the same window, sea skimming at Mach 2 from the northwest, while the ballistic missiles descended from above. 78 weapons, 3 different vectors, 3 different threat types, a simultaneous multi-axis saturation attack against the most powerful warship on Earth. The general had given this operation a name. He had told his staff that today was the day the era of American carrier dominance ended. He had told them that by sunset, USS George Washington would be incapacitated in the South China Sea, and the world would understand that the era of free American military movement in Chinese-claimed waters was over. He had made 6 catastrophic mistakes. First mistake: the DF-21D mobile launchers had been under continuous surveillance for 9 days. Not Chinese surveillance, American surveillance. A classified constellation of U.S. Space Force imaging satellites, supplemented by a pair of RQ-4 Global Hawk high-altitude reconnaissance drones operating at 65,000 feet above the South China Sea approaches, had been tracking the 4 DF-21D launcher batteries from the moment they departed their garrison facility and began moving to their pre-surveyed firing positions on Hainan Island and the Leju Peninsula. Every launcher vehicle, every support truck, every generator, every communications van, every piece of equipment that accompanied the batteries to their firing positions. By the time the general gave his final arming order, U.S. Space Force analysts at Peterson had a targeting package on all 4 batteries that was accurate to within 3 meters. The targeting data had been transmitted to USS George Washington's strike group commander 41 hours earlier. Second mistake. The strike group was not configured for routine operations. The general's intelligence picture of USS George Washington showed a carrier conducting normal flight operations, a standard peacetime sortie schedule, aircraft cycling on and off the deck in training patterns, the battle group in its normal dispersed formation. What the intelligence picture had not captured, because the U.S. Navy had been deliberately managing its electronic emissions to project exactly this picture, was that the strike group had been in an elevated defensive posture for 36 hours. Every Aegis system was in active search mode. Every VLS cell was loaded with the appropriate mix for the assessed threat. The carrier's flight deck sorties were not training flights. They were combat air patrol rotations, maintaining a continuous airborne presence of armed F-35Cs at distances and altitudes optimized for the exact threat axis that Chinese aerospace engineers had designed the DF-21D to exploit. The strike group looked routine. It was anything but. Third mistake. The J-16 Combat Air Patrol had been detected and tracked for 4 hours. The 8 J-16 fighters that the PLA Air Force had positioned north of the carrier's track to execute the PL-15 ambush against the carrier's airborne aircraft had been operating their radar systems in what their crews believed was a low probability of intercept mode, designed to avoid detection by U.S. electronic warfare assets. Their belief was incorrect. The AN/ALQ-218 electronic warfare receivers aboard the EA-18G growlers that had been operating at altitude on the carrier's northern flank had been logging the J-16S emissions continuously. Their positions, their patrol patterns, and their weapons loadout, assessed from the radar emission signatures, had been known to the strike group's electronic warfare coordinator for 4 hours. The F-35Cs assigned to the counter-air mission had already been briefed, armed, and positioned. Fourth mistake. The H-6K bombers were not invisible. The pair of H-6K bombers carrying the YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missiles had been tracked from the moment they departed Lingshui Air Base on Hainan Island by the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye Airborne, early warning aircraft orbiting at altitude east of the carrier. The E-2D's AN/APS-145 radar had established solid tracks on both bombers within minutes of their takeoff and had been updating their positions continuously throughout their transit to the launch point over the Paracel Islands. When the bombers reached their weapons release point and the YJ-12 missiles separated from their pylons, the E-2D crew already had 18 inbound supersonic cruise missile tracks building on their display. The intercept geometry for the F-35Cs and for the strike group's surface-to-air missile batteries had been computing for 11 minutes before the first YJ-12 motor ignited. Fifth mistake. The DF-21D's maneuvering re-entry vehicle had a vulnerability that PLA engineers had never fully resolved in operational testing. The terminal guidance system that allowed the warhead to correct its trajectory toward a moving target required a continuous data link from an over-the-horizon radar network and from targeting satellites to function correctly. Without that data link, the maneuvering re-entry vehicle's terminal correction capability was significantly degraded. It could still maneuver, but the precision that made it lethal against a carrier reduced dramatically. The EA-18G Growler's AN/ALQ-99 jamming pods operating in a coordinated sequence that U.S. electronic warfare planners had specifically designed against the DF-21D's guidance data link frequencies, were activated at 3:43 p.m., 60 seconds before the first DF-21D launch. The data link that the missiles needed to find USS George Washington was flooded with noise before the missiles left their launchers. Sixth mistake. There were 2 Aegis ballistic missile defense ships positioned in the exact optimal intercept geometry for a DF-21D launch from Hainan. Not 1, 2. USS Lake Champlain and USS Chancellorsville, both Ticonderoga-class cruisers with Aegis BMD capability and SM-3 Block IIA interceptors in their forward VLS cells, had been positioned in their intercept stations 38 hours earlier, placed specifically to provide overlapping coverage against a DF-21D launch from Hainan Island. Their positioning had been determined by U.S. Pacific Fleet's Missile Defense Planning Cell, using the same trajectory analysis that Chinese engineers had used to determine their launch points. The Americans had done the math first. The ships were exactly where they needed to be. What happened in the next 27 minutes removed 78 Chinese weapons from the battle space and reduced 4 DF-21D launcher batteries, 2 H-6K airframes, and the Southern Theater's Integrated Air Defense Command infrastructure to inoperable wreckage. At 3:44 p.m., the Space Force Satellite Network registered the thermal signatures of 12 DF-21D motor ignitions within a 90-second window from 4 separate launcher positions on Hainan and the Leizhou Peninsula. The SBIRS alert reached USS George Washington's Combat Information Center within 8 seconds of the first launch. The strike group commander's response took 4 seconds. He transmitted the execute code word to every U.S. asset in the theater. USS Lake Champlain and USS Chancellorsville had already computed their intercept solutions. They were waiting for the code word. SM-3 Block IIA interceptors began launching from both ships within 11 seconds of the execute order. The SM-3 Block IIA is the most capable sea-based ballistic missile interceptor ever deployed. Its kinetic kill vehicle reaches altitudes exceeding 1,000 kilometers and can engage maneuvering re-entry vehicles at closing velocities that make terminal evasion mathematically impossible at the engagement ranges that the 2 cruisers had been positioned to exploit. The Aegis BMD fire control system assigned interceptors to tracks with overlapping coverage. 2 SM-3s per DF-21D track in the initial sequence, with a second engagement layer ready if any primary intercept failed. The DF-21D re-entry vehicles, their terminal guidance systems struggling through the EA-18G jamming of their data links, were still attempting to correct their trajectories when the SM-3 kill vehicles reached them in the upper atmosphere. The kinetic energy of impact at those closing velocities is absolute. 9 DF-21D re-entry vehicles were neutralized in the mid-course engagement layer. 3 survived the initial intercept sequence and descended toward terminal phase. Their maneuvering capability significantly degraded by the loss of precision data link. Their trajectories now approximating simple ballistic paths that the Aegis terminal engagement layer could handle with standard SM-2 intercepts. All 3 were neutralized before reaching the battle group's inner defensive envelope. 12 DF-21D missiles. 12 intercepts. USS George Washington was untouched. The YJ-12 supersonic cruise missiles were engaged simultaneously, 18 of them approaching from the northwest at Mach 2, sea skimming at 15 meters above the water. The F-35Cs assigned to the outer defensive layer had been holding their engagement positions for 37 minutes. Their AIM-12 ODAMRA-AMs reached the lead, YJ-12 elements at 62 miles, well outside the range at which any YJ-12 warhead could threaten the carrier. In 3 minutes of air-to-air engagement, the F-35C outer layer removed 11 YJ-12 missiles from the battle space. 7 continued inbound. USS Chancellorsville engaged 5 with SM-2 missiles at medium range. 2 reached the close-in engagement zone and were removed by the combined fire of RAM short-range missiles from USS Chancellorsville and the carrier's own Phalanx CIWWS systems. 18 YJ-12 missiles, 18 neutralized, 0 impacts. The J-16 Combat Air Patrol engagement was the most one-sided of the three. The 8 PLA Air Force fighters, positioned north of the carrier and armed with PL-15 missiles, expected to be engaging U.S. aircraft that were unaware of their presence. Instead, they found 6 F-35Cs that had been holding at long range and low altitude, invisible to J-16 radar, invisible to every PLA sensor in the area, already inside optimal AIM-120D engagement parameters. The F-35Cs fired first. They fired from beyond the PL-15's engagement range. The J-16 pilots received their threat warning receivers alerts at the same moment the first AIM-1 or 2OD warheads detonated. 4 J-16S were removed from the battle space in the first salvo. 2 more were removed in the follow-on engagement. 2 surviving J-16S disengaged and fled north toward Hainan at maximum power. They did not reach it. 2 additional F-35Cs that had been held in reserve north of the carrier's track were waiting on the J-16S egress route. Both remaining aircraft were removed from the battle space before they crossed the Paracel Islands' northern boundary. 8 J-16S engaged. 8 removed from the battle space. 0 PL-15 missiles reached U.S. aircraft. Now USS George Washington answered for all of it. At 4:02 p.m., 18 minutes after the first DF-21D launch, the strike group commander transmitted the strike execution order. The carrier had turned into the wind at 3:51 p.m. and had been launching strike aircraft continuously for 11 minutes. By 4:02 p.m., 22 aircraft were airborne on strike missions: 8 FA-18E Super Hornets, 8 F-35C Lightning IIs, 4 EA-18G Growlers maintaining the jamming architecture, 2 E-2D Hawkeyes coordinating the airborne picture. The first priority was the DF-21D launcher batteries. The 4 launcher complexes had been tracked continuously throughout the engagement, their positions current to within 3 meters. 8 F-35Cs each carrying 2 JASSM-ER cruise missiles, 16 missiles total, were assigned to the target complexes. The JASSM-ER's low radar cross-section allows it to penetrate Chinese air defense coverage without triggering engagement sequences that would defeat conventional standoff weapons. All 16 were released at 4:17 p.m. and impacted their targets between 4:31 p.m. and 4:38 p.m. Both Hainan batteries were assessed as total losses. Both Leju Peninsula batteries were rendered inoperable. The H-6K bombers, both of which had turned for home after releasing their YJ-12 missiles, were removed from the battle space by F-35Cs using AIM-120D AMRAAMs at long range. Both aircraft were intercepted over international waters southeast of Hainan. Both were rendered inoperable before reaching Chinese territorial airspace. USS Lake Champlain and USS Chancellorsville contributed Tomahawk salvos at 4:09 p.m. 44 missiles combined, targeting the PLA Rocket Force Command infrastructure at Sanya Naval Base, the operational coordination facility from which the DF-21D strike had been directed, the communications relay center that connected the launcher batteries to the targeting satellite network, and the Integrated Air Defense Command Post that had been coordinating the J-16 Combat Air Patrol. All 3 facilities were struck in a time-on-target sequence that compressed the impact window to under 4 minutes, preventing any effective damage control response. At 4:22 p.m., 2 B-1B Lancer bombers that had been holding on alert over the Central Pacific, positioned there by STRATCOM 48 hours earlier, in response to the intelligence indicators that the DF-21D operation was being prepared, were released to their targets. Each B-1B carried 24 JASSM-ER missiles, Their targets were the PLA Air Force's fighter and bomber forward operating bases at Lingshui and Meilan on Hainan Island, the facilities that had generated the J-16 Combat Air Patrol and the H-6K launch platforms. 48 JASSMs impacted across both installations between 4:44 p.m. and 4:52 p.m. The Lingshui facility's runway sustained 3 penetrating warhead impacts that rendered it non-operational. The hardened aircraft shelters at both installations were struck by JASSMs using delay-fused warheads that penetrated the shelter roofs before detonating. The maintenance facilities, the fuel storage infrastructure, and the tower and radar installations at both bases were rendered inoperable. The full accounting, compiled by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command by 6 p.m. the same afternoon: 12 DF-21 D ballistic missiles launched, 12 intercepted and neutralized, 0 impacts on USS George Washington or any U.S. vessel, 18 YJ-12 supersonic cruise missiles launched, 18 neutralized, 0 impacts, 8 J-16 fighters engaged, 8 removed from the battle space, 0 PL-15 missiles reached U.S. aircraft, 2 H-6K bombers removed from the battle space, U.S. personnel removed from the battle space, 0 U.S. aircraft rendered inoperable, 0 USS George Washington undamaged. Flight operations continuous throughout the engagement. In retaliation, 4 DF-21D launcher complexes rendered inoperable. PLA Rocket Force Command Facility at Sanya rendered inoperable. Direct Tomahawk impacts on all 3 priority structures. Lingshui Airbase runway, non-operational, hardened shelters incapacitated. Meilan Airbase, hardened shelter infrastructure incapacitated. Fuel storage rendered inoperable. Communications relay center destroyed. Integrated Air Defense Command Post rendered inoperable. PLA Rocket Force and PLA Air Force personnel who sustained fatal outcomes across all strike packages, 206. PLA assets rendered inoperable. 14 launcher vehicles, 2 H-6K airframes, 8 J-16 airframes, 3 command facilities, 2 airbase runways, 41 hardened aircraft shelters. USS George Washington recovered her last strike aircraft at 5:17 p.m. The flight deck crew, yellow shirts, red shirts, purple shirts, all of them moving in the practiced choreography of carrier aviation, turned the aircraft around, refueled them, rearmed them, and had them back at alert status within the hour. The sun was lowering toward the western horizon, turning the South China Sea from blue to gold to orange. And the carrier that was supposed to have been incapacitated before sunset was holding her course, holding her speed, holding her position in international waters that no power on Earth had the ability to close. The E-2D Hawkeyes went back into their orbits. The F-35Cs went back into their defensive rotations. The EA-18G Growlers refueled and returned to their jamming stations. The machine reset itself, as it always does, completely, thoroughly, without ceremony, ready for whatever came next. In the underground command facility on Hainan, the general who had told his staff that today was the day American carrier dominance ended, sat before a battle damage assessment that contained none of the words he had expected to write. The carrier was undamaged. The carrier group was undamaged. All 78 weapons had been neutralized, and the infrastructure of the Southern Theater Command's long-range strike capability, the DF-21D batteries, the H-6K forward bases, the Air Defense Command architecture, had been systematically dismantled in the 2 hours since his first missile left its launcher. The era he had promised would end had not ended. The carrier was still there. The waters were still free. And the sun set over the South China Sea exactly as it always had. Over open international waters patrolled by the most capable naval force in the history of human civilization. This is what happens when you fire carrier killer missiles at the United States Navy. You do not find a carrier that is unaware of your preparations. You find a carrier strike group that has been tracking your launcher vehicles for 9 days, that has positioned 2 Aegis cruisers in the precise optimal intercept geometry for your launch trajectory, that has jammed the guidance data link your missiles depend on before they leave the ground. You find F-35Cs holding in silence beyond your radar coverage, already inside AIM-120D range of your combat air patrol. You find JASSM-ER missiles already assigned to your launcher coordinates, B-1B Lancers already airborne with your air bases and their targeting computers. You find that the carrier killer you spent 17 years and billions of dollars developing achieved 0 impacts on the ship it was designed to remove from the battle space. And you find that the response, systematic, precise, and delivered within 90 minutes of your first launch, has rendered every asset you committed to the operation permanently inoperable. USS George Washington holds her course. She always will. The South China Sea is free. It always will be. And on this afternoon, at 3:44 p.m., under a cloudless tropical sky with unlimited visibility, the United States Navy made that fact absolutely clear to anyone who needed the reminder. 27 minutes, 78 weapons neutralized, 0 U.S. losses, and the most sophisticated anti-carrier weapon system ever developed by any adversary, rendered into wreckage on a Chinese island before its designers could assess what had gone wrong. The carrier sailed on,